In the mental health field, too often, we've made it seem as if it's just in your head.
The landlord can hijack the rent by 20%. That impacts people's mental health.
Can't have a profit-driven mental health care system if we want our people to be connected and healthy.
Da 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 da! Today we are introducing Russel, our very special guest. Take it, Max.
Wow, okay, that was incredible.
That was like a wrestling introduction.
Yeah, that's right.
Should we start wrestling somehow?
Yeah, let's wrestle with this topic. Right.
Okay, so welcome back to the British cooking show called It's Not Just in Your Head. If you've been listening by now, you already know what we're doing. If you don't, read the description. You can listen to our previous episodes. This is a podcast about the intersections between economics, society, culture, mental health, run by two therapists. My name is Max, and we have Harriet Fraud here. And today we have a special guest. Her name is Russel Ndip. Did I say your last name right, Russel?
That is correct.
And we encountered her through an email to us because she has been listening to us since day one, is what she said in the email. And she just shared some personal information, the things I'm remembering. And Russel, you can flesh this out a little bit more, is that you immigrated with your family from Cameroon at the age of 8, and that the topics of our podcast had made you start thinking about things like depression and anxiety and your life and people's lives and capitalism and all those interesting topics more and more. And so you wanted to reach out, and we had an email exchange, and I think that's kind of it. And here we are, right?
Yeah, that's correct. Thank you guys for having me. Yeah, so that's very true. I immigrated here at the age of 8, and I've kind of just always been interested in these topics between mental health and how that intersects with culture and economics. So when I started listening to you guys' podcast, I felt really seen and very heard by that, because you guys are two mental health professionals that are kind of thinking in the same wavelength as me. So that was really exciting.
Yeah, well, I think it's really important because you have an inside-outside view at the same time, because children get their sense of what gender they are and what it means socially by the time they're 3, between 1.5 and 3. So you came here with gender moldings that came from a different society. And now you come into this society with its gender transitions and upheaval, and you came with a certain social sense. And America is in turmoil now in a different way, probably from the way Cameroon was when you were growing up. And so it would be interesting to explore how you see gender from the outside inside, and how you see what's going on in the society with both the eye of an American and also the eye of a Cameroonian, if that's the way you say it.
Yeah, for sure. Cameroonian culture with respect to gender is a lot more conservative. So there's still a lot of strict gender roles. There's still a lot of submission that is expected from women. And so there's a part of my upbringing in America that still has my mom sort of instilling, you need to learn how to cook for your husband and you need to listen to what he says. And then I have an outside culture that is starting to become more equal. Women can, they don't have to be the housemaker. They can be the worker. Or so there was kind of like I have both messages at the same time. And because most of my upbringing as an adolescent is in America, I was more drawn towards, I don't want to be in that tradition where there's still these subservient female roles when I'm growing up in a society that's telling women you can be and do whatever you want.
Well, in American society now, women have to do both, because unless you're in the top 10 or 20% maybe, but the top 10, you're going to have to work outside of the home in order to make a living. And you're also often expected to do all the domestic work and the childcare and also the emotional work in the household. So it's a big transition. And most American women are now single, which is probably different from the situation of Cameroonian women.
Yeah, and I speak when you're saying about both women have to do both. I definitely see how that's kind of changed as immigrants moved into the U.S. Especially my parents. There was no way they were going to survive without both, both people working. Like you're saying, most people can't survive in a single income home anymore. So, but the expectation of you're still a homemaker, you still have to do all the cleaning and the cooking doesn't go away. And so I've seen my own mom as we're growing up take on a mountain of duties that I couldn't even imagine doing now, as just an expectation. It was my dad never cooked. She did all the cooking, she did all the cleaning, and she'd still work the two jobs and go to school. So that is a huge burden that I still see, not just in my culture, but like you're saying, outside in the rest of the American society. Those roles are not quite as progressive as we would like to think they are, even though we have more women working.
That's true. And in fact, that's one of the reasons why the majority of American women are single. And
Right.
42% of Americans have children outside of a marriage because women are rejecting marriage. It's women who initiate most divorces now. It's a whole change. And I think for you, who comes from a culture in which traditional roles usually include male protection of women's labor in the house, this
Yep.
is quite a change.
Yeah, definitely. Because yeah, definitely having to see that burden doesn't get relieved even though women are now working is kind of an interesting thing to grow up in. It almost like their work is doubled. And I was always a child that was like, mom, I'm never going to get married, because she was kind of saying, oh, you need to learn how to cook so you can find a husband. And then my defiance was, well, I don't need to get married if
Mm-hmm.
that's the role I'm going to have to play, is still work and take on all these duties anyway. That doesn't seem like a good deal to me. So I could totally
Yeah.
speak to that rejection of that.
I'm curious too, Russell, because when you say your culture, so it's, we could say, okay, well, Cameroonian culture, that's your culture, but it sounds like you kind of like are in a lot of different sort of overlapping parts of culture in the US, right? Like sort of immigrant, I'm just going to use like terms like immigrant, Cameroonian, African, but would like African American fit? Would like Black American fit? I mean, we've got women, right? There's like 50 different things you could kind of pick and choose from. But I mean, do you feel like you sort of belong in any one limited set of categories, or do you feel like you're pulled into different categories, or are there, sort of role confusions in any of those? Or
It's like very situational. I know people talk about code switching, so I never quite feel like it's one all the time. So if I'm around Cameroonian people and we're just, or West Africans, there's a certain mode I feel like I have to be to fit in there, and it's only a certain part of me. And then around African Americans, sometimes I feel like I fit in there in that specific situation, but it's again not the totality of me. So it's kind of this always switching on and off depending on the situation, and trying to fit into any sort of dominant categories, because it does overlap quite a bit. Like I have certain commonalities with other immigrants. Like my friends in high schools were other children of immigrants. I
Mm.
certainly have some fidelity to other African Americans that we can relate to. And then same thing with just the regular, white majority. There's some similarities, and they're constantly kind of overlapping. And I never really feel like it's one or the other.
There's a thing that's very interesting to me, which is that Black Americans, Black African Americans, their women have always had to be more independent because minority men never made a family wage that could support their families. And
Mm,
so there's a tradition which is really covered beautifully in Alice Walker's books, in which women are dominant because they are primary breadwinners and because men have been a sometime thing because their incomes have been so limited.
right.
And most overwhelmingly, the most African American children are born outside of a traditional marriage,
Hmm.
which wouldn't have been so in Cameroon.
Yeah, no, no.
So that the whole gender situation is different.
And yeah, that's something I've noticed too, in sort of the African American community, that there is this very um, Black women have to shoulder all these burdens, financial, emotional, And I've seen that kind of discourse happen on Twitter. That's not something in our community that I can really relate to, because I don't know a lot of families that are just, just being raised by the mom, even in just my little community. So that's definitely something I noticed. But even so, I still think in our West African culture, while there's like a male sort of dominant, you're supposed to be the one making all the money, there's still a very like women have a strong um, emotional role to play in their families as the emotional leader, so to speak, in the same way that I think Black women here in America have to be.
And I think white women also have to be. It's
Yeah,
women who
exactly.
usually do the emotional labor of taking care of people emotionally, and also the social emotional labor of connecting families with relatives, with friends, and reaching out.
Yeah.
And so that for most American women, traditionally, the closest emotional partner is a best friend who's a woman, even if a sexual partner is a man.
Right. Yeah.
Is
That's
that
definitely
so in
similar.
Cameroon? That's
Yeah,
similar?
absolutely. That's very similar. There's a lot of, we have a very extensive like network, especially when you come here, you need to be around a lot of other people in your culture. So women, they help each other a lot. I mean, even things like childcare or bringing food to your home. So there is a lot of that. Women are interconnected for that emotional need in a way that they aren't with their husbands, because that's not really something that's, as you would know, like really encouraged by society for men to be opening up and to be emotionally connected. And even more so, I would say, in Cameroon, that this very still in the beginning stages of that. There's not a requirement for men to really emotionally connect with their wives that way.
Yeah, it means, at least in the United States, that now that the overwhelming majority of divorces are initiated by women, men remarry immediately, women don't remarry, and men are usually utterly emotionally bereft because their emotional contact has been mixed with their sexual contact.
Right.
Whereas women's relationships are still intact, with the exception of the relationship with the husband.
Yeah.
So it's a huge dislocation for men.
Yeah, and women are much more equipped to sort of deal with that because they have their own extensive emotional networks outside of the marriage.
Yeah, it's a great strength of ours. 13, it's interesting, 5 years after being married and divorced, 13% of women remarry and 85% of men. Because they're looking for an emotional, sexual, social connection.
Yeah, that's a huge gap.
I wonder if some of these factors maybe explain that the suicide paradox thing that I kind of mentioned in the solo suicide episode I did, of the rates of suicide among white men are really high and among Black women are really low. And just the sociology I looked into what there were different sort of ideas, but nobody really knows for sure. But this idea that African American women having to be more independent, sort of like matriarchs, and to maybe build more resilience and independence, and not as much dependence on other people to sort of take care of them. Maybe like that seems like it's one theory, whereas like white males historically, through the different various economic shifts that have happened over time, not really figuring out how to well, on the one hand, holding this sort of delusional idea that you're like this tough, rugged individual that doesn't need anyone, while also like really extremely depending on women and various others in your life to sort of take care of your emotional needs. If that maybe explains that like huge disparity between white men and Black women in suicide, I don't know.
Yeah, and I think it's true of white men and white women. White men commit suicide most of all.
Yeah, and I've seen some people talk about that figure like sort of going up, obviously, as the economy have changed, and as men maybe are losing that status as breadwinners if they are unemployed or in areas where there's not really a good, strong economy, that sort of contributes to suicides. Yeah, I thought that was a sort of part of it as well.
Yeah, because if you define your role primarily as a breadwinner and you can't make the bread, then you feel useless and unwanted and unneeded. And those are suicides of despair.
Right.
And so I think that those are differences but they're also a continuity, because it sounds like in Cameroon, women also are the emotionally stronger gender that
Yep.
works out ways to support one another with or without men.
Yeah.
I think we've undervalued the power of those connections and that solidarity in mental health.
Well, and connectivity, because we always talk about this, Harriet, of the
Mm.
importance of like that four legs idea that you keep
Mm-hmm.
mentioning. I've been thinking about that a lot since you first introduced that idea to me, and how as you kind of keep taking away parts of the legs of that table, of course there's gonna be depression, anxiety, and maybe the suicidality stuff might creep in. But I actually
Mm-hmm.
wonder, your perspective, Russel, from the sort of, I don't want to say the quote unquote immigrant experience as if there is such a sort of monolithic thing, but I would imagine if folks are coming over as immigrants, and so living in California, in like southernish California, the word immigrant usually for me, I assume South American,
Mm.
Latin American, not usually Mexican. Like the immigrant
Hispanic,
population
yeah.
where I live, yeah, is like vast majority is like Mexican immigrants. So I usually don't think, when I think Africa and like black, I don't think like immigrant. I don't link those things. But like, so for your culture and your family and stuff, like what the experience of connectivity must have been like, where it's like there's presumably this more traditional, um, maybe connective, collectivistic kind of culture, because typically that's just in more traditional cultures. But then you come to the United States, where there's like the rugged individualism thing, and so there's like the outsider experience of we're immigrants and we're black, and so you have this sort of predominantly sort of white American individualistic society, and where the sort of connectivity piece comes in, like if folks feel like, oh great, we're really disconnected from society at large, okay, but we have our immigrant community where we feel connected to them, like where are the points of sort of resilience and connectivity that kind of mitigate against the mental health problems that would probably come from being a total outsider in your society.
So yeah, I mean, what you speak about is like when we first came here, you came here because my mom had a friend who sort of paid our way here, and my mom ended up staying with her at her house, and then we ended up staying with my mom's cousin. So we had those two points of contact, but outside of that, it was completely isolated. We didn't. My parents didn't have friends that they knew or could hang out with or could reach out to that weren't Cameroonian. And it wasn't until we sort of moved to an area where there's more Cameroonians that also became their primary network. So on one hand, yeah, they feel very sort of outside of white majority culture, but because they found a Cameroonian community that's so widespread, I think it does mitigate for some of that disconnect, because my parents necessarily, they don't feel like they need to have that contact with the outside white majority society, because they have all their needs met by their own community. If they need money, we have sort of groups to lend people money with no interest for that. Or if they need childcare, they have a big network of people that will help you with that. Or if you need a job, for example, someone will give you a recommendation. So there's this rich community that ends up having to form here to survive, because you feel like you're not necessarily going to fit into the majority society, even amongst other black people. You still feel that disconnect because you're an immigrant.
Well, that's really an amazing mental health boost, because if mental health is based on an ever widening, deep but ever widening set of connections, Americans are painfully disconnected. Especially, they're starting to politically connect again,
Yeah.
but there's a phenomenon of withdrawal that has been commemorated in the book Bowling Alone, which then that theory has been tested by Robert Altmeyer several times. But the original book found that there were fewer Americans involved in 2009 in any kind of community effort, a PTA, a blood drive, a bowling league, a political party, than were involved in bowling leagues alone in 1970 that Americans had withdrawn from connection. And connection is mental health, so it's very dangerous for us. And there, your immigrant community has a huge advantage.
Yeah, and I often think how the broader American society can sort of have some of that. You know, there are obviously, as a sort of African American, I have things that I don't necessarily always like about my culture, but that's one thing that I always thought was amazing and great, because I don't think a lot of them would have been able to survive mentally and just financially without some sort of community like that. So how in our current capitalist economy do we create and foster the kind of places where people can have that kind of community is often something that I think about.
You know, one of the ways that people have done that successfully and in the 70s and 60s and are starting again is in a political culture of wanting a better society, whether you're in Black Lives Matter or you're in the Democratic Socialist Party, or if you're working with AOC, you know, that there's a sense of building a community and a hope for the future, which gives people emotional as well as political and intellectual connection, which we otherwise wouldn't have because the old connections have broken down.
And I think for that stuff, it gives you there's the assumption that's bringing everyone together that, there's an acknowledgement that things are not great and that things need to be made better. And so by working together, we can maybe build a better future for each other. At least this is my interpretation of almost every political engagement people are, engaged in. Or, I mean, that's typically what kind of leads me to stuff is like, let's make things better together. But this also makes me kind of wonder from the, not that I can take on an immigrant perspective, quote unquote, but like if you're a group of a whole bunch of people that came from like totally different culture, totally different country, and then you come to America, like how comfortable would you feel engaging in political activity? Because, there's sometimes some risk in that, like putting your neck out, right, for your values. And B, like how aligned sometimes maybe will your values even be in the existing sort of political efforts. And that also leads me to wonder, like when Harry just brought up Black Lives Matter, like how much to say like the quote unquote African community or African immigrant community identify with Black Lives Matter or not? Like, are there tensions there? Is there like total overlap? Like I don't have no idea what that looks like, but I mean, do you have any insights on that, Russel?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, because this is kind of as these have become brought to the forefront. I've had these conversations with my parents, and they have their own problems with racism in this country, obviously, because people look at them and they just see them as Black people, and then on top of that, when they open their mouths, they hear their accent, and then they sort of treat them as African immigrants. So there's a double sort of discrimination that they feel. So they do feel, at least I would say from my own parents, solidarity with the Black Lives movements because they felt that mistreatment. And then on one hand, though, their sense of identity has been formed in a place where everybody looks like them. So when they're growing up in Cameroon, there's no one really, you're not Black because there's nothing else to point out in difference to that. So when they come here, yes, they face that discrimination, but it doesn't feel quite as like personal because there's not this historical and generational emotional damage attached to that. So on one hand, while they do think Black Lives Matters is a movement that they can get behind because they see the discrimination that's happening to them, it's not necessarily something that they want to come and be wholly involved in, because there's not that sort of generational passed down trauma that I think some Black Americans tend to have, where they feel really strongly about that.
Yeah, I also think that if you're Black in America, you go into all kinds of situations, whether you're little or older, where people give you messages that you're not very good and they don't want to be with you. And
Right.
if you grow up in Cameroon, you don't have that sense that you're a pariah because of your skin color. Everyone's in the same boat. It's one of the reasons that Black leadership has often gone to West Indians and Caribbeans in the United States, because they didn't grow up with this sense of people casting them in an inferior light.
Well, so now I got a class question though, because that just made me kind of wonder, right? Like, so if I think in part because of Black Lives Matter and everything kind of surrounding it, it's much easier now to sort of just accept, probably for the white majority, that, well, yeah, so anti-Black racism is like a thing, first of all, and second, it's like insidious and it's everywhere, and it's sort of infected every part of our lives. But in Cameroon, since that wouldn't be a thing, right? Like, I'm sort of just thinking about this, maybe not for the first time, but like, if there's no anti-Black racism in Cameroon, right? Like, that's a foreign idea. They're typically, in every society, there's usually some hierarchy and there's stratification. We kind of covered gender a bit earlier, but are there class divisions in Cameroon where like some Cameroonians are treated worse because of class positions based off of middle to upper class position Cameroonians?
Yeah, there's definitely something similar, and we just had this conversation with my mom the other day. This is kind of a post-colonial problem of Cameroon is like 70% of it was a French colony and 20% was a British. When Germany after World War I, they sort of split it that way between France and Britain. So there's a minority of Anglophones, and that's the side where I come from, and there's a majority of Francophones. Now, Francophones have all the political power, so they make up most of the the cabinet, and the president is a francophone, and all sort of news is in French. And there's a feeling from Anglophones that francophones look down upon them because they were given sort of all the political power, and they're using that to sort of subjugate like the Anglophones. In fact, that's currently a conflict that's happening right now in Cameroon, is that there's a lot of sort of some violence from the francophones to the Anglophones. So there's that kind of division that's felt very deeply from my parents, feeling like we don't have as much political power, we don't have as much societal say because there's a dominance, a Francophone dominance. And then on top of that, they also have tribal differences. So they're not a very strongly nationalistic, as from what I can tell, West Africans don't have a strong nationalistic identity as much as they have a tribal one. So you're very much like, this is a tribe I'm from, and those other tribes kind of stereotype about them, or you might judge certain other ones as being higher or lower than the other. And discrimination does happen on the basis of tribes. And so that's something that they'll feel. And so when I try to explain it in terms of that way, they'll understand the sort of American hierarchical structure, because they can at least see it from the side that they're an Anglophone and they're from a certain tribe, and they receive certain discriminations and have certain problems because of that. So yeah, there definitely is.
Is there also racism? So, because I've had clients from the Caribbean who say there's strong racism, that light-skinned people are favored in the Caribbean over dark-skinned people. And that's certainly so in some countries. Haitians are looked down on, for example, because they're darker than people from Santo Domingo.
Yeah, there's definitely some colorism. Yeah, for sure. I mean, I'm like the lightest person in my family, and they always made comments about that. That's something that's constantly pointed out, like, oh, look at her, she's got such nice skin, or she's so bright. And there's a lot of like skin lightening and skin whitening products that are very popular, because there's still a sense that, yeah, the lighter people are better looking or smarter or whatever. There's still that discrimination the darker you are, because you will hear comments made about it. And even in my own family, people have made comments. So that's still very much an issue I've found across the Black diaspora. I found that to be kind of a problem sort of everywhere that I've interacted with.
You got to wonder though, like, where that came from, like, because I would think
colonialism. I think.
Well, that's what I'm saying, because it's like that doesn't sound like a quote unquote natural, like that. I don't know. I wouldn't see it ever making sense, like organically coming out of a culture, unless the idea that like lighter, wider, more European associated heritage types of things are sort of superior or whatever. So that's crazy though, to think that it's well, I guess that's a history, with colonialism. This is hundreds and hundreds of years. So that's, of course, it's saturated into cultures. Yeah.
It's one of the things that was remarkable about Native Americans, because runaway slaves could almost always find harbor with Native Americans, because in Native American culture, the darker you are, the more beautiful. And so they were considered very beautiful people. Whereas in the rest of the racist society in the United States, they weren't. So that
Mm-hmm.
there was a lot of harbor for runaway slaves in the Native American community.
Yeah, and I was just going to mention if you're talking about sort of colonialism being the reason for this, is that very stark example of Rwandan genocide, where you're
Mm.
talking about a genocide that happened as a result of Europeans going, these, picking out their features, the lighter, the smaller nose, and giving them the power, giving them, these are the two Hutus, or I think that's the lighter ones, and then and then having that play out through generations to the point where it causes real resentment over
Mm.
something that was not was ascribed to them, that wasn't something that was sort of quote unquote natural to that culture. It was forced upon them. So yeah, those things definitely have real consequences over time.
You know, I didn't know that about the. I have a friend who actually studied like restorative justice stuff in Rwanda specifically because it's like such a. I mean, I hate to say it like this, but it's like a great, because of how extreme the genocide, sort of like post genocide. Like, okay, how are we going to do this now, right? Like, how are we going to actually live with each other? It's actually been like a big sort of educational kind of training grounds for a lot of people who study like conflict engagement resolution, restorative, transformative justice. But I'd never, this friend had actually never mentioned that historically, that like, where did this come from? Like, I mean, maybe there were some sort of tribal beefs that were just there, but that colonialists sort of came in. They were like, oh, look at this great sort of wedge. We can just, you know, we can just sort of drop this in and just let them sort of fight each other, so that we can sort of benefit. Which also makes me think. I mean, tactically, whether you're sort of a colonialist, an imperialist, a capitalist, that these are pretty common tactics that I think, like even the what happened after Bacon's Rebellion in the U.S. of like seeing European and African slaves and indentured servants rise up and burn down the plantation, like that's sort of what initially gave them the idea in the plantation class to say like, well, let's sort of like, let's codify this whole race thing, and pit them against each other. So, you know, that they'll fight each other instead of us. It seems like this is just a really old way, you know, of dividing people up so that they can't work together and improve each
Unite.
other's lives.
Yeah, absolutely. It's one of the things that you can see in terms of Trump calling African countries shithole countries, that he's decided that some people are to be completely dismissed. And then the British colonials, when they came in, they immediately created racial hierarchies. So if you were lighter, you got a better deal. And even in the American plantations, those light skinned slaves, usually the results of master's rape, were given house positions rather than field positions because they were more acceptable because they were lighter. So that this hierarchy of racism went all the way through and is so pernicious because it
Mm-hmm.
divides people. And one of the good
Yeah.
things about Black Lives Matter is that, first of all, that knee on the neck is something George Floyd died from, but Americans have been feeling economically, whether they're white or black, since the late 70s. And so that a huge number of the people marching in the Black Lives Matter protests are white because the idea is all of our lives matter. And those
Mm-hmm.
people whose lives you felt mattered the least are the people we're championing because all of our lives matter is the
Mm-hmm.
message behind it. And it's very important. I wonder how this upsurge has affected the Cameroonian community, this recent upsurge of protest in the United States.
Yeah, I mean, we haven't, because of the coronavirus, we haven't been able to go to a lot of meetings where I've been able to hear some of my other Cameroonian community really speak on this. But as far as my parents go, and I've talked to them about this, they feel it because some, like I was saying earlier, some are strong because they feel the same sort of racial discrimination. And for them, it's an awakening to the rest of the world. Like, this is how you've been treating us. And so it feels very seen, like this, everyone else gets to see how we're being treated, and for them there's a doubly there because they're also immigrants. But
Mm.
I think it's for them feeling a sense of like, oh, the rest of the world is waking up to what I have to deal with all the
Mm.
time.
Yes. Yes, that makes sense because, on the one hand, by being an outsider, you have the pride and solidarity of people who haven't been regarded as inferior from the beginning. But on the other
Mm-hmm.
hand, in the United States, bias against immigrants and against African Americans and their racism, you can have a double dose.
Mm-hmm.
So you have both the advantages and the disadvantages in this culture.
Right. And I will say that's kind of something that my parents, as I'm speaking here because I don't want to speak for everyone, have sort of had to learn from the time that they came here till now, is understanding like they had the same sort of perceptions about Black people in America that the media sort of gives off, like they're
Mm.
responsible for their own positions in life, and if their culture would just change, maybe their economic situation would change. So they had that very outsider perspective. And my mom, who's been able to work in with sort of lower class communities, has had to reckon with the fact that it's not just a culture problem, or if they just did XYZ, and see how these structural issues affect the way people's lives happen. And that's kind of increased the solidarity that she and they have felt about sort of Black issues in America, by really sort of being and able to see it from their point of view. Because otherwise I think they still would have had this idea that they're not doing well just because it's kind of their own personal problem.
Right. Yeah, I think that's really important. And I don't, well, to some extent, Fanon has talked about that, Frantz Fanon, that what it does to you to be regarded as less in all these random people's eyes is a huge psychological problem that African Americans suffer from.
Mm-hmm.
And other people who grow up in societies with majority people just like them don't suffer the same way.
Mm-hmm.
And that and also the systemic racism means that at the same time you deny people and you give them the worst jobs and they make the least money and they can provide them for themselves the least, and then you point, see they don't even provide for themselves. It's quite a catch-22 here.
Yeah.
And yet the irony is America is a country of immigrants. The only people who weren't immigrants were the Native Americans, who didn't even get the vote till 1965. So it's strange because scratch the surface of most Americans, it's a generation or so
Right.
that we were immigrants, and we were considered less because of accents and so on.
Yeah. And it's interesting to see how not that many generations later there seems to be like a policing of who gets to call themselves an American, who is
Mm,
more American than the other, when like you're saying, it's a nation of immigrants. At some point everyone's family lineage
right.
has immigrated here.
Max, when did your grandparents come? How far away is it that in your lineage that you were an immigrant family?
Yeah. Oh man, that's like such a good question to ask white people in general, like a
Mm,
discussion for white people to have, I think, especially. So lucky for me, my grandpa, who was a journalist for like 40 years, actually he and my grandma were journalists. They actually wrote this like really, really long book about, like, after they retired, they published a really boring book that read like the book of Genesis, that was about our actual like heritage,
mm.
because they did a ton of research on this. So according to that really long book they published for our family, it's called The Empire of Cousins. Um, the I guess so my dad's side, which is that those sets of grandparents, they can trace the Golding family back to the Saxons, not Anglo-Saxons, but Saxons in, like, England area, that but that they came, what was it? I don't know, really damn long time ago, like many, many generations ago, like a couple hundred years ago, but that the closest to our family's lineage was like on that side what the hell is the term? Not gold rush. The Oregon Trail.
Mm-hmm.
So they all came through the Oregon Trail during, I mean, what was that, like the 1800s or something?
Uh-huh.
So they were basically English immigrants who'd been around somewhere in the colonies for quite a long time. But then, so my mom's side is more Portuguese. So there were Portuguese immigrants and they came to Half Moon Bay, which was it's sort of a coastal town near San Francisco, which was largely Portuguese, and they came in. God, sorry, you're like really. I'm having to jog my memory here. They came in. I think sometime in the 1800s. My great grandmother, who I still knew when I was a kid, she spoke a little bit of Portuguese, but her parents were like all they spoke was Portuguese. So that's like I'm like fifth generation Portuguese on my mom's side as well.
My husband's family, he's a first generation American because they were refugees from Nazi Germany. And my grandmother's family came over in 1835 as a political leftist, but her husband was a, was an immigrant. And my mother's family were immigrants, Hungarian immigrants, and she was the firstborn American child. So it's only really a generation or two. And in my husband's case, he's the first generation. And I think that we're typical white people in that it's only a few generations back, if that, that we've come from somewhere else with an accent and with a lot of discrimination.
But something that I've been kind of rethinking a bit, because I've been reading parts of Barbara and Karen Fields' book, Racecraft, and something that they talk about is that during the slavery era, we kind of overlook sometimes like how many white indentured servants there were, and there's like different layers of indentured servitude. Like some was just like basically forced permanent labor, like not too dissimilar to chattel slavery, but there are some distinct differences. Obviously, some were there voluntarily, but they point out also that even like before the Civil War, apparently something like 80 to 90% of people who we now call white people of the South were not slave owners. They were actually like peasant farmers. And it kind of made me start to think a little bit about like how we still conceptualize race. And this whole idea of racecraft is like almost well, I don't want to go too far down the rabbit hole, but it's that since race was invented by the plantation class as we understand it, we keep finding ways to reproduce the idea. Even within like liberal and progressive circles, we're sort of recycling the idea of race as if it's real, and it kind of causes all these problems. But in that same sense, like my family heritage of like the Portuguese came thinking like, oh, we're just going to settle and like we can fish, and like thank God we can just get away from the shitty situation we were in and we can be fishermen. And my dad's side of the family were saying, well, we can go out west and maybe catch some gold, and like we won't have to do this indentured servitude thing that like actually the majority of white people are doing. But the fact is, like, most white people are actually indentured servants, quasi owned by rich people, obviously very differently from chattel black slaves. But anyway, it just made me kind of start rethinking like, well, wait, what exactly do we mean by whiteness and like Europeanness, because we don't really dig very deep on just that issue a lot as white people, I think.
And also, what does it mean? So, for example, the Irish, since the British were very interested in horribly exploiting them, they had to find them inferior in order to do so. So they decided that they were a different caste of humans. They called them white chimpanzees. They said that they were more sexual, more lazy. They said the same things that they say about every immigrant group. And they were considered a different race, the Irish. And so, just as they would say, no Irish need apply, Jews were considered a different race. No Jews, no Irish, no blacks, need apply. Whatever group you're interested in exploiting becomes inferior enough so you don't look at their suffering. And people forget how recently we've been in those groups. Most Americans have, because also we can't forget most women who came to to what was the United States, the colonies in the early times, were bondswomen. They got their passage free for 7 years of being married to some guy and having his kids and doing all his work, emotional work and housework. There's a good, yeah, they were rented property in a sense, whereas slaves were permanent property. They were rented property for 7 years. And yet we don't learn about that in our history books. And so we don't have a sense of it, of what circumstances the mass of us came from.
Yeah.
And we should, instead of learning about those lousy pilgrims every year at public school 81, we could have learned something interesting about our history.
And that's really, that's funny, because a lot of people do really assume that these racial lines are really sort of natural and permanent, and they don't. Yeah, even me, it's like I before coming here, I would have never really understood how, like, Jews certainly became white when they were separated for a long time, or how, like you're saying, the Irish would have been considered a different race, just because you imagine, it feels like race realism is a thing, like we are these divisions and that's that.
And like when you say natural too, I mean, that's the thing where I wish I could articulate this. Well, Dorothy Roberts does this in Fatal Invention as well, just like the Fields sisters do for Racecraft, but just that so because like the biological essentialism idea, which was like extremely normal for quite a long time amongst the ruling class, and the sort of trickle down assumptions, which is like, oh well, Black people like to work hard in the fields and da 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 da. There were these sort of like biological assumptions, like they were just born that way, right? And then eventually, and that gave rise to like race science and even those ridiculous, what would they call it, like was the damn like runaway slave syndrome. So even around like in the mid 1800s, it was like psychiatrists like concocted this bullshit idea that like slaves that ran away had like a mental disorder or something like that. So but even since then, it's like this idea. So this like liberal and progressive seeming notions, like I don't know, like I'll just think of a couple stereotypes, like Black people just naturally sort of like to dance, or Black people naturally, or there's just these weird sort of essentialist ideas that still will like somehow recraft themselves, even in seemingly very like progressive circles. That, I mean, I've probably done this, but we're all kind of constantly doing it because we're still like swimming in these really bizarre set of assumptions, but they're sort of reinforcing the idea of race and removing basically history and ethnic and cultural sort of dynamics that actually kind of explain certain differences. But then arguably, I don't want to say more importantly, but I mean, the thing that I've been more interested in recently is like, if you think kind of from a little bit more of a Marxist perspective, just like, well, what, instead of who are, like, what are people's identities? Like, what do people do, right? Like, what is the actual work people do? And how does labor, where does labor come in? And that's still somehow something that we like, it's not like we can't talk about it, but somehow we just like talk about it almost the least,
Yeah. Well, we don't look at class in the United States because it's been drummed out of the academy in the anti-communist McCarthyite crusade of the late 40s and 50s, where to talk about class made you a traitor, and communists were thrown out of the unions, and so were the socialists. And so it's just class only came back into the discourse in 2011 with the Occupy's 1%, 99%. And I think we really have to completely dismiss the idea of what's natural. Human beings are not natural. We are social creatures. We grow up with a brain. We're born with a brain the size of a small fist. We die with a brain the size of a Nerf football. It's all social connection that builds the brain. And so nothing about humans is not socially constructed. And so we have to look at wait a minute, why do we think this way? What happened? It was really quite instructive for me to learn about the Irish being considered monkeys, and because they were by the British, who let them starve and exported their potatoes in the potato famine, because after all, they were lascivious beasts. I read these rationalizations of that and was quite impressed. And that history is not part of the history we are taught in school. Who would have known? When I did the research and realized 6% of Americans were allowed to vote when we won the revolution, whoa, because between women and Native Americans and all sorts of people of color and white men without property, that was 6% of the people in the land of the free and the home of the brave. But we don't learn that.
I mean, even those, like the sort of descendants of the modern day deplorables in the South, like this is kind of what my rethinking is looking like now, where I'm like, if somewhere like 90% of people now classified as white in the South during the time of the Civil War actually basically wanted nothing to do with the slave trade. And they were like, I just want to grow my own food and sort of keep to myself and not bother with this ridiculous thing they're doing of like forcing all these Africans to do shit for them.
Right.
That even those people, right? I mean, it's really easy, I think, for those of us like the city folk, the sort of liberal progressive types of white folk to be like, oh, those backwards one-toothed hicks, when it's like, they were actually not. I mean, you could argue, well, they were complicit because if there were a lot more of them than the plantation owners, why didn't they go help sort of fight with the slaves like that? I think that'd be the preference, but like they weren't. I think even stereotypes about those so-called white people are actually harmful, and that it simplifies their history and it potentially creates yet another wedge between us. When it's like, look, they're all people too who need jobs and healthcare and everything that everyone else needs. Let's stop thinking of them as just sort of inherently
white trash.
Yeah, but just the simplification of people. So that's a sort of like, it's not reverse racism in that stupid way people talk about it, but it's more like that's racecraft in motion of saying like, oh well, all those stupid 90% of those Southern whites were just a bunch of racists. It's like they were actually like really self-sufficient people who probably they could have been brought in as allies in some kind of movement, and they probably were opposed to the sort of hyper-capitalist Gilded Age industrialism that was now probably like sort of making their way of life much harder, right? Because it's harder to be self-sufficient and grow your own stuff in the South if now it's like you have to work in a factory to make a living.
Also, some of our history there has been also repressed. I was so impressed reading Adolph Reed's book, Hammer and Hoe, about the 1930s powerful black and white unity of tenant farmers who were organized by the Communist Party and were enormously powerful, and they were united together to stop the kind of oppression of tenant farmers who are kind of like feudal serfs, black and white together.
And that's what you're speaking of, Max. That's something that sort of has kind of annoyed me about certain liberal spaces, is this kind of looking down on lower class whites that I think is like really destructive, because as the class conversations are becoming a lot more, especially in coronavirus, this is the kind of silver lining that I can see, is that as people are becoming more class conscious, I think I can see the unity happening, because if it were split, it's like just racial divisions and their class didn't come into we could keep fighting this sort of like quote unquote race war forever. But until people are willing to treat even people like who they think is white trash as someone who deserves, a good job and healthcare and have the same goals and wants in life, I think we won't get out of that. We won't really have a multiracial coalition without that class conversation. So that's something that the Black Lives Matter thing kind of makes me a little bit more hopeful, because it's not just, what black people screaming at white people. It's kind of everyone's just mad at the way it is.
Yes, I think that's well said, Russel. Also, I don't think Trump would have gotten such enthusiasm from the South if people hadn't felt looked down on.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, but the whole deplorable thing, right? I mean, that's like Hillary Clinton's thing. Right. It's just like, look at these buck-tooth, hick, redneck, low lives, which is also, I mean, that's been the attitude of this sort of, this is kind of jargon, but this is the idea, like the professional managerial DNC machine. It's just like you go to these big cities, you kind of find these strongholds where you can get a bunch of votes, and you kind of just don't give a shit about anyone else. And it works really well with like sort of snooty, highly educated, professional.
Right, the New York Times people.
That's right, exactly.
Look at these piece of shit deplorables. We don't care about them, and then them say, "Well, guess what? We're going to vote for somebody who's just going to like light the entire country on fire. Like, screw you guys." Whether or not they even identified with Trump. Like, I think a lot of it actually was, I mean, reactionary is kind of an understatement. It was like almost like vengeful. Like, fine, if this is how you feel about us, then
yeah,
like
it feels that way.
It's a nihilistic rage at this system that makes them feel like less.
And I think so. There's this another writer who writes with Adolf Reed sometimes. Walter Ben Michaels, I think is his name. He has this presentation called "The Trouble with Diversity," and it's not what it sounds like. Like, it could sound like a right wing thing, but he shows through these graphs of like the different sort of quintiles of income across racial groups. So like there's almost no point even saying this anymore of like, if you randomly select a white or a black person, like the white person's gonna have a lot more money and wealth and like assets, whatever, versus the black person. But when he was like, if you look between racial groupings, you actually find that the top like 10% of black people have like the majority of wealth among black people. The top 10% among white people have the majority of wealth of white people, but somewhere between like 80 to 90% of people within each racial grouping actually don't have very much money, and that actually includes white people. So like the other sort of danger of, I don't want to say danger of Black Lives Matter, because that's like kind of silly, but the potential right now, I think, with Black Lives Matter is that like hopefully it's saying like, well, Black lives haven't mattered as a part of a class stratification system where Black people have been sort of at the very bottom of it, and so we need to lift everyone up. And that you see that sort of narrative in some places, but in others you kind of don't. And I think because I'm seeing this sort of racial binary thing kind of play out still, where it's like, oh, well, white people have this and black people are victims in this way. And it's like, poor white people, I mean, they may not be experiencing discrimination and, the implicit bias stuff in the way we understand it against black people is definitely not being experienced in a victimized way for poor white people. However, poor white people actually are the majority within the racial grouping of white people, right? So you have to kind of inject class in there somewhere, or you're just going to start kind of shuffling the chairs around of like who's rich, right? Like,
Yeah. And what you've done, if you've given some people a sense that their whiteness puts them above everybody and everybody who isn't white, and so they hold on to that as a token of their survival, and they're willing to fight for it. Whereas the rest of us, who are the vast majority, say we need each other to win, which is what Martin Luther King said. It has to be black and white together. And that's what Malcolm X said at the end, too, before they were both shot. That's what they said.
Yeah, and they were much more class focused towards the end of both of their and because they understood that as an integral part to actually lifting black people up, because you can't really end racism without really talking about a class problem, because as long as that exists, there'll always be a structure to support structural racism.
That's right. That's well said, Russel.
Yeah, and because the other thing is, I'm not like an expert on the Black Panthers or anything, but like I think they mostly were coming from a sort of Marxist and like specifically Maoist perspective. I think in that the idea of like black people being oppressed was like they are part of the sort of proletariat, right? So there was that sort of idea. It wasn't, I mean, and there were elements, my understanding is that there was a very big sort of the black nationalist, like separatist sort of, and Harriet, you were like actually there. Like,
I was, and very active. There were huge splits, because what happened was, as soon as the Panthers posed on the post office steps with guns, they increased their membership hugely because the FBI joined, and the Operation Great Wurlitzer was invented to keep race politics about race only, so whitey was the enemy, and excise class from the whole discourse. And so that their original trajectory, which was Maoist and was liberatory, was totally overwhelmed by the FBI influence of adventurism and racism against whites, because racism can come in all colors and is destructive no matter how it shows its head.
And one kind of concern I do have right now too with I don't know, see, because even when we say Black Lives Matter, like it's sort of similar to when people say Antifa in some regards, and that like Antifa was never a group. It was like, mostly kind of some like ratty white kids that dressed up in black and were like willing to punch Nazis at protests or whatever. It's like there's no like organizational structure. Like my understanding is, like, I mean, there's Black Lives Matter chapters. There are some that have actually incorporated as 501c3s, and they're like receiving funding from big foundations and stuff. But like as a quote unquote movement, it's actually really hard to characterize like
Yeah.
exactly what
Right.
it is. Like there aren't, there's like Alicia Garza and people like that who are sort of like quote unquote leaders, but they're not really leaders. Like they're not formal. They weren't like elected by anybody. But one thing that I'm sort of like observing this, like where I think the class integrated elements are making me really hopeful, but there are some elements that I think are looking kind of separatist,
Mm.
and there are chapters that have the ones that have formed as 501c3s, and I've only heard little chatter about this. I haven't followed super closely, but that the ones that are receiving big sort of foundation funding, right, that they're sort of welcoming, well, sort of ruling class influence, like this sort of what's happened historically from funding in that way is that you can sort of create a wedge better, or you can sort of embrace and then extinguish movements by funding them in that way in some regards. And so I could see the ruling class saying like, well, let's actually fund the more separatist elements of Black Lives Matter, right? And it sounds a little conspiratorial.
Well, it is a little
It is, but
conspiratorial
it's
and
got a,
deliberate.
yeah, I totally feel you on that.
Well, that was the case in the 70s, which I've studied, and of course it would be there, because what you do is you fund certain elements that want reform that's strictly legal, and you leave the mass out of it. That's what happened with the women's liberation movement, which devolved into useful things but that had nothing to do with social transformation, things like rape crisis centers, battered women's shelters, and vying for funding for those things and accepting state funding for those things to keep them going. And so they became institutions, and they were no longer a movement,
Yeah.
which has a big goal of liberation and opportunities for everyone together. And that's what we have to watch out for, I think.
And yeah, to echo your concerns, Max, it's kind of when I saw this big corporate embrace of
Mm.
Black Lives Matter, that's where I
Uh-oh.
really started to feel the concern, where it was like, if it's so easy to just put out a statement and a hashtag and do it, then it feels like it suddenly starts to lose its steam, because people are sort of pacified by the idea that, oh, we've got, Nike now saying hashtag Black Lives Matter, we've done it.
And class is excised. Great.
Exactly, and it's easily forgotten that way
It
because now
is.
we have a corporate sponsor.
Walmart is great example there, where they support Black Lives Matter verbally, but they pay everyone so terribly they have to go on food stamps. What are you
Right.
doing? And they're the richest family in the world.
Well, this is the other part of the racecraft thing of sort of the tokenizing, fetishizing, like that kind of stuff that's like I think really prominent and like progressive and sort of corporate wokeness, is that you can just say, all these big corporations, tech companies, whoever, I don't know, Starbucks can say like, okay, we're going to make sure all our managers are black now.
Mm.
We're going to create like diversity committees and force we're going to spend all this money on implicit bias and diversity trainings and stuff. But at the end of the day, from their perspective, it's really just, it's kind of like costs. You're trying to reduce liability, because like you're like, well, great, we don't want to get sued for being racist. Or if they say the wrong word, like we better make sure that people actually, our workers, know which words you don't use in front of the wrong people or whatever. And so we know what we can fire people for, and then we can sort of publicize that we're firing racists or something like that to like promote our brand, right? Like that's sort of their perspective. But there's this huge, like, I mean, even if you look at sort of the MSNBC, like Rachel Maddow, like Joy Reid,
Mm-hmm.
like all those sorts of kind of liberal pundits, like they're also sort of celebrating that sort of thing, right? Like, oh, that,
Mm-hmm.
Starbucks just spent $1 million on implicit bias trainings, when really, like, I mean, the research kind of shows like implicit bias trainings have limited, if not harmful outcomes. Like they kind of make people uncomfortable, like at work. They're like, crap, now I don't know.
Yeah, what to
Yeah, and
say.
hyper vigilant. Yeah.
Or are you supposed to like go up to your black coworker and just be like, hey, I just wanted to check in. Are you doing okay? Because like all these mass killings of black people, and then black people are like, dude, what? Like, I don't even know you. Like,
Right.
we're not
I've
friends, dude.
totally
Like,
felt that. Yeah.
I remember, it's really such a anti-revolutionary push when the Panthers had their big demonstrations in New Haven. I saw Yale workers changing signs because Yale has been a reactionary institution often, from fry Bobby Seale to free Bobby Seale before the demonstrations so that they could look good. And these big corporations have given what amounts to like 2 pennies. But for their vast wealth, it looks impressive that they gave $50 million. The Waltons are the
Right.
richest family in the world.
oh, Russel, I was going to say, so for, not that you are the sort of monolith, not, you're not the token, African community representative or something. But just you have that perspective a lot damn better than we do. Like this conversation, right, versus the sort of, the tokenizing, fetishizing, woke capitalist anti-racism versus like, I don't know what the alternative would be, a more liberatory class first, like, these debates, like, are you seeing this sort of within the African community or Cameroonian community at all? Or is like you were saying, just sort of solidarity with BLM in general? Because it's like, well, finally, like, this is being acknowledged. Like, what are you kind of seeing?
Yeah, I guess I was going to say that it's not quite that level in the Cameroon community where they kind of talk about sort of the corporate anti-racist message. It's just more on the level of at least we're being heard. And I think they're just as sort of pacified by that acknowledgement as kind of the regular majority would be. At least we're being seen, at least it's being talked about more openly now. But there's still a discomfort on having to be hyper focused on your race all the time. I felt that way after this George Floyd protests all the time. I constantly have to feel like I'm the spokesperson now. People are constantly asking my opinion. Oh, what do you think about these protests? What do you think about this Black Lives Matter? And then you feel like a sense of responsibility to say something that encompasses an entire community of very different opinions.
Right, where there were actual differences. I mean, there's stark, like, if nobody's ever watched this, I'd recommend just YouTube search Black liberals, Black conservatives debate, like, just to like sort of break out of the bubble of what we're assuming, that like there are people within racial and ethnic groups that actually entirely disagree with each other. And like, I mean, to me, it's like a good reminder, right? Like, women don't all agree, Black people don't all agree, white, men don't all agree.
Right.
So anyway, it just sort of, I think it can reconfigure your brain a little bit when you're assuming like, oh, this person must know what it's like to have the Black experience or the immigrant experience or the woman experience.
And talk about it as if they are the entire experience, which is silly tokenism.
Exactly.
Although it's sort of both. It's like sometimes it's like, you'll have, this is where it's the dialectic of like, no, there's no such thing as a monolithic, like a group. There isn't perfect consensus. And yet there are some sort of shared lived experiences across people, so it's like, how do you juggle both? And it's just kind of tricky.
You have to know that it's a balance, I guess.
Russel, do you have any kind of like closing, thoughts, remarks, ideas for listeners while we still have you for the next few minutes?
Yeah, I guess it's just like I'm feeling very hopeful that hopefully in this Black Lives Matter coronavirus times that everyone's sort of awakening to a common and shared humanity, and hopefully that brings about not more division but a sort of unity in fighting the system and not each other. So that's my big hope.
That's a great hope that we share. We certainly do. Couldn't be better said.
I'm a little bit split between pessimism and optimism. I kind of fluctuate, but
same.
When I'm leaning into the optimism, that's kind of what I see as well. But I do worry too.
Well,
we can be vigilant.
Of course, everybody's worried, but I think this is the best hope we've had for a long time.
Yeah. Well, then there's that asteroid coming too. So, no.
Well, maybe it's Marxists from Mars who are coming to save us.
Marxists from Mars.
Marxists from, they would be from Mars.
Is that our band, guys? Is this our new band, Marxists from Mars?
Yes.
Okay, I got the cowbell.
Right.
All right, thank you guys so much. It was a really enjoyable conversation.
Also, if you want to support us, patreon.com/it's not just in your head. If you are an iPhone user, give us a 5-star because it games the algorithm. And you can email us at itsnotjustinyourhead@gmail.com. By the way, listeners, if you have enjoyed anything you've heard Harriet say in this program, you will definitely enjoy Capitalism Hits Home, which is a solo program that Harriet does through Democracy at Work, which is a worker-owned cooperative that produces other great programs such as Economic Update with Richard Wolff and the Anti-Capitalist Chronicles with David Harvey. I can't recommend enough that everyone also listen to Capitalism Hits Home if you enjoy It's Not Just in Your Head.
Capitalism Hits Home is a sort of broader overhead view. It explores the way that capitalism shapes our personal lives, our psyches, our relationships, our families, and it looks particularly at the sea change in American personal life as all Americans, but the top 10 or 20% of Americans, have our security and our chance for a future become as precarious as it always was for minorities and families headed by women. It's not just in your head, and Capitalism Hits Home are definitely complementary.
And if listeners would like to check out Capitalism Hits Home, Harriet, where should they go to find it?
Either on YouTube or Democracy at Work or on my own website, harrietfraud.com.